Y'all like that I was on the different side of the screen in the thumbnail? Hey guys, welcome back to another creator-owned video. Today I'm going to be talking about a very special project, Thorn, the complete Proto-Bone college strips by Jeff Smith. This is a project that's special to me because Bone was like the first comic book that, was like serialized in a trade paperback that I ever like read and really found an attachment to. And, for a lot of people, I think it is like a gateway into comics, and it's very representative of, this trend that was created into the 90s of creator ownership and, people who decided to go their own way outside of like the Marvel and DC system, but also outside of the daily comic strip format that is seen represented in here. So I think there's a lot to learn from this collection, and that's why I wanted to cover it and sort of like unpack my observations. This channel exists, to sort of look at creative projects under that microscope, and also to sort of solve the mysteries of like, how does one break into being a comic book creator? And there's like no better representation I can think of that than Jeff Smith. The first thing that I'm going to mention about this book is that it was actually crowdfunded on Kickstarter. And, such in the same way that, 30 years ago in the 90s, people were starting to break away from larger publishers and were finding avenues to self-publish and get their comics out there. I really believe that Kickstarter is like the new method of doing this, and it sort of speaks for itself that someone like Jeff Smith has identified that. What I think is wise about doing this as a Kickstarter is that Kickstarter is an all or nothing platform, which means like you can raise all of the funds needed to print and distribute this book, this finished material up front, without like the risk of maybe it not being sort of the financial success you need it to be. To me, it would make sense to like sort of hedge your bets and go direct to market, right? Go to the people who are your established base. I made a recent video about why I think Kickstarter is sort of becoming the industry standard for releases like this, and this project is one of the projects that I cite for that reasoning. So give it a look if you're interested. Something that right off the bat you can identify here and what is like different is that this book is in the sort of like long, wide format that if you've ever had like a Peanuts collection or Garfield or Calvin and Hobbes or like anything that was in daily papers, that is the presentation, because that is how Jeff Smith went at it. I'm assuming that's partially to do with, not only his inspirations like Scrooge McDuck or, other comics that were this, reading the funny pages was like definitely a primary way to get comic cartoons each day. So I think like, there's a carryover of that inspiration, but also it was just the platform that was available at the time. And so that's like the first thing we get. The foreword here mentions that Jeff went to CCAD in Columbus, Ohio, and made like there was a decision to go to Columbus because it had this newspaper with a syndication of 30,000 copies a day. I can't even imagine the sort of output that is required to do a 4-panel strip 5 days a week for 4 years. But like, here is an artist who put in their 10,000 hours, right? And to think that all of this work then just like goes away and is lost into the annals of history because this is literally the Proto-Bone, the primordial bone. That is crazy to me. And so, the thing I'll mention about that is, despite all of that, a lot of what makes Bone is still very well maintained in this comic strip. Even right off the bat, there's this initial interaction with Ted the Aphid, if you're familiar with the book. This is like straight out of the actual Bone comic. So to me, it's really cool to see that represented, that Jeff was working on this book for years and years as a child and had this idea in his head and used the platform of the student newspaper to try this out and to, like, you know, regiment himself and develop a readership, and come out of it with a portfolio. I'm going to take a second to like express, like, you know, some things about this. So first of all, at the time, there wasn't really many college programs that offered cartooning. And so this is very like entrepreneurial to just be like, well, I'm going to go to, you know, this school and do this. And maybe perhaps they did. I mean, they mentioned later in the foreword that they like got a course created, but this even tracks with like Joe Quesada of Marvel's experience that he has in Words for Pictures by Brian Bendis, that he's at school in New York and they're making the case for cartooning. And, you know, if I was even aware at a young age that cartooning was something you could like do professionally and that there was like a formal education for it, I might have been encouraged to keep drawing, because I was very much like a doodler, and I still have like that passion. But I went to school for video because I wanted to like make films, but I still love comics and I love the art form. And so in a similar way, I just want to give more reinforcement to this. Anyone can just like, you don't have to go to school to be a comic book creator. You don't have to go to school to be a filmmaker. If you want to make a comic, just make a comic. I know that sounds a lot easier than it is, but like that's all it technically takes. The value that student media has is this sort of platform to, and the infrastructure of like institutionalized learning to really get into the groove with something like this. And hey, what do you know? In my own experience, I did college radio at Kent State University in Ohio, and I interviewed Jeff Smith on my radio show, because long before, you know, YouTube owned the world, that was sort of like what was around. And, you know, I had a desire to learn more about comics, and Jeff Smith was one of my favorite authors. And so I reached out, and, you know, he very graciously accepted the interview and encouraged me to pursue, you know, my desire to make a comic book. And I appreciate that. And it's certainly not something he ever had to do. But what's cool about that is, like, here I am 12 plus years later on the same audio equipment, you know, that I interviewed him on, working for that company. And it's just cool how these things come full circle. But I had a similar experience, to say the least, where you sort of like, that's like the value of student media, but it's by no means what you need to do to get there, because if anything, it really just teaches you how hard it's going to be. And Jeff Smith did not leave college with this book didn't even get picked up for syndication, and you know, they get into that. So, you know, basically we have this introduction about Jeff Smith's you know, just his process, and him, you know, doing 5 strips a week. I just think it's like a very valuable lesson here, because even after all of that, Jeff Smith left college and was pitching Bone as a syndicated newspaper strip, right? And they mention how no one is looking for a comic strip like this that has these fantasy elements. Bone has this like weird quality that it's like Mickey Mouse meets Lord of the Rings. It's in some ways it's very cartoony. It's very much like a classical cartoon, but it also has these like hyper realistic kind of characters with this fantasy backdrop that you could see as being like a little too intense for like something that, like I mentioned, might be sitting next to like Doonesbury or Garfield. But you know, there's a lot of great gags in it, a lot of stuff that, you know, is just really, again, really indicative of Bone. And not, you know, not everything was cut. You know, there was plenty of stuff that does make it into Bone. Even things like just like the way the Red Dragon is portrayed. This gag is hilarious because if you only have like 4 panels to tell a comic, or to tell a story, like you're not going to draw the dragon's whole body, right? So like he always comes from outside of the panel, and you can sort of guess on how massive he is. Like that, I just think is such a funny quality that was brought over from the needs of this strip and into the way Bone actually functions. Because like by the time he makes the book, it's like he could draw it any way he wanted, but there is still very much these elements that he carried over from, you know, just the way he developed these characters. And I think that's like part of what makes the Red Dragon like memorable when you go and read the real Bone. The real Bone. When you go and read like the final version, again, it's just like he comes in this way that's like very cartoony and has the sensibilities of a daily strip like this, but it makes that character like just like easier to grasp and like really defines his attitude. And so I thought that was interesting. I also find it interesting the ways in which a lot of, you know, because of the way this is told, the stories will carry over from one day into another, but almost always there has to be like a punchline, you know? So like there's like a week's worth of material here, but he is like more often than not ending it with some kind of punchline. So, you know, it's a sequential story. You know, first we have this like Prince Charming kind of character comes in, and like that's the joke. Bone, you want to arm wrestle, and like little you know, little unseemingly phone Bone has like huge muscles. And then, you know, the guy makes a, you know, dumb comment, and then like Thorn just like trounces him, you know. So I just think that there's a lot of great craftsmanship in here. Like Jeff Smith already really understands so much of how this process works, and I just think this is something that I'm sure you can study it, but I tend to find that comic book creators, it feels like they pick this stuff up along the way. There's a lot of shorthand where like people do things for a certain way, but they don't really like know why. In my interview, I remember Jeff Smith telling me like, you know, like King Arthur will approach a body of water, and like water symbolizes purity. Like there's just like these shorthands in storytelling people pick up that are really interesting too. One of the other like major differences in here is just the fact that because it's for like a mass audience and for like a daily newspaper, the book is self-referential, and there's like a literal self-insertion of Jeff Smith as a villager in the world he created. And you know, there's just like times where they do take like, they take jabs for like the sort of customary political cartoon kind of commentary or pop culture, what's going on at the time. They mentioned that Grandma Ben wears Adidas. It was probably like the hot shoe at the time. They mention things that are in the news just to make it like timely and relevant. I actually love the way, like, as soon as I saw this, I was like, oh, that's Jeff Smith drawing himself. I think it's hilarious when you see how an author like perceives themselves, and I do just get a kick out of like college Jeff Smith. It's just a funny thing to see, and it has like such stark contrast, like in the fantasy world, and he just looks like a 20-year-old who smokes cigarettes and hangs out on campus and stuff. As the characters are teasing him, just kind of a fun thing that like he refers to it as this kind of variety hour strip, and so all of that like goes away by the time Bone needs to be turned into something else. So I think a big takeaway I want to get into here is like this book comprises 4 years of hard freaking labor and a great mastery of storytelling. Some of the artwork is still, like especially Thorn, like there's some pages where he's still figuring out her anatomy, but like this is a lot of work, and ultimately it was enough that it was like, it's in Jeff Smith's mind, that's just training, right? Hindsight being 2020, you have to imagine that he leaves college and he starts pitching this to newspapers for syndication. Hey, I have this story. Do you guys want to pick it up? Some of the only things, like if you're thinking like an editor, is like, well, some of the strips are dated because there's, cultural commentary, or a lot of it is about being at the Lantern, right? It's not like immediately transferable. And because it's like a linear story like that, it was probably hard for a newspaper to just accept, right off the bat. They mentioned that, a fantasy, like a long form fantasy, is kind of a hard sell for something like a newspaper. And it's like a little violent, it's a little mature. So perhaps not the right audience. There's even a part in there where like they mention that there's so many requests from one of the editors for changes that they're just like, no, we're not going to do that, which I think has actually been to some degree part of Jeff's experience trying to get Bone adapted into a larger project. Like the integrity of it really matters to him. So there's 2 things I'm trying to say when I say this. One is that you can put in your 10,000 hours of labor and have a very, very wonderful, fleshed out universe where, again, like, here's Phony Bone doing his thing. Like, these characters, we have them pretty down pat. By the way, I freaking love Phony Bone. He's so funny. Just all of his expressions are just downright hilarious. But anyway, like, all of this work can really just be seen as practice, and you should not. I've said in other videos that if I did 4 years of work, or, but I come out of it with 6 issues for a comic book, then I could then pitch to Image or Dark Horse. That is not 4 years wasted. Similarly, all of that investment of time can still be seen as just practice. And, you should push forward and do that. Like, you should do a book that it's okay to do a project that, doesn't go all the way, because what Jeff Smith had the sort of maturity to figure out was like, okay, I think a lesser creator would be like, well, I tried it. I tried Bone and they didn't want it. You know, and in my interview, he mentions that, you know, he was pitching this at the same time Bill Watterson is pitching Calvin and Hobbes, right? And so he, you know, someone might just go, okay, that didn't work. I'll move on to another project. But, you know, here, let's pull this out real quick. There's these wonderful inserts here of artwork, one of which includes the, you know, the sort of timeline of transformation of Bone. So we can see Jeff Smith was working on Bone from a very young age and how transformative this was. And what he did that was brilliant was like, okay, this is not working out as a daily comic book strip. What am I going to do? I'm going to turn it into a comic book. There it is, the first page of Bone. And that was like, boop, like voila, a light goes off. I'm going to turn it into the epic storyline that it is and treat it as what I imagine was a monthly issue comic series, or maybe every other month. I don't know how much, you know, I got into Bone very close to the end of its run. And so I just think that's so smart to, you know, tell yourself, I say this a lot, like tell yourself the story and then tell it again. And so over the course of 4 years, Jeff Smith got his idea down and built a viewership, and he took another 5 years off and then came back with Bone, and, you know, the rest is history. So I just hope that lesson gives helpful understanding of, you know, how truly hard it is to do something like this. I will say that Jeff Smith is one of the odd rarities that very few people do their magnum opus as their first project and have success with it. So kudos to you, Jeff. You are an inspiration. That's really the bulk of my commentary here. I wanted to just share a couple other things. There's this wonderful process artwork that I got with the tier that I paid for anyway, where, you know, we see the line art followed by the inking. I adore Jeff Smith's like inking and just the, I don't know, just that line work and the sort of like variance of weight, but also with, he's really good at curves for whatever reason, you know. I could look at it for hours, and I will gladly go visit the Billy next time I'm in Ohio, because I'd really love to see some of his originals. And then a colored page. You know, he really, here's, you know, the progression we see of how he crafted Thorn over time from, you know, these sketches to something a little more funny pages to, you know, a little more serious. And, you know, ultimately the character that we have today who straddles the line well between cartoony and realistic. I think he really landed on a wonderful design for Thorn. She's just a character you're easily able to kind of get the idea of who she is. Also, this is just hilarious. Ted the Bug exposed. Ted is like the little aphid who you only ever see as like his outline. And so to see that he has like a stash and nipples and a tattoo that says Bug Life is hilarious and not something I ever thought I would get in my life, but there you go. One other thing that's sort of fun to comment on is, I think, just a good little note here at the end. He mentions that when he was starting this project, he was corresponding with his classmate Durf Backdurf. And being from Ohio, I'm familiar with Jeff. I'm familiar with Durf. I've you know, had the pleasure of meeting him at at the Cleveland premiere of My Friend Dahmer. And they're corresponding because it's wild to think that these two were classmates and were both doing the same thing. Durf was doing political cartoons and was experimenting with the student media, and Jeff entertains the thought of this college collection. And Durf goes, "Oh, fun project. You're braver than I. My college cartoons stay under the back room sink at the Billy Ireland." I love that. Like, there's this weird sort of like insecurity that people have with their earlier works. And I'm no different, where sometimes I look back at my earlier stuff for inspiration. I like to see like where I was coming from and the sort of values that I've retained. But they make a very valid point that, like, if it wasn't for this museum, literally for the infrastructure of this museum being on campus at the school that he attended, all of this artwork, this very valuable collection, worthy of $300,000 of crowdfunding investment, this could have just been lost and discarded, right? Jeff Smith, as a creator, could have been like, I'm not really proud of it, and never preserved it. And so I just want to sort of summarize this with, this entire video with my belief that these things, even if they're not the end result someone might be pursuing, there's so much value to have something like this where you can look back on, the basis for what inspired this project. And, there's just a lot you can learn from looking on these things. And so I think we all owe a little debt of gratitude for Jeff Smith to sharing this to us. Again, I mean, the point is just to share, the work and the process, but I like to come at things with this sort of perspective because I like to get in the weeds on this stuff. But yeah, I hope that gave a little bit of context for how much work goes in to do something like this. And even if it takes, darn near 40 years to see the light of day again, that might happen. So yeah, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, I'm really enjoying your comments and your interactions and your engagement. I just kind of wanted to push this one out quickly while this was fresh on my mind, and see if I could share something insightful. So let me know if you thought it was helpful. If I made a mistake, you can crucify me in the comments section. Please subscribe. I'm really grateful we've now passed 350 subscribers on the channel. I've been getting about, close to 100 new subscribers a month since I started doing this. That's outstanding. And I'm really enjoying the interactions here. So, who knows, maybe Jeff Smith will, graciously entertain the concept of a reunion interview at some point in the future. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching and take care. We'll talk to you later.